I want to be able to hear it. If I can't hear it, I'm not going to get credit.
So I'm the president of the board, and we came up with the idea, or the training team did, since it's the month of January and everyone's getting ready to file their taxes, is to figure out what to do with this tax credit that is just so mystifying to all of us. And when we adopted our two kiddos, we had no clue what to do with this money. We knew it was a tax credit. Well, how do you tap into it? And so, luckily we found a tax preparer that knew what to do. And I still didn't know what we had to do with it. And he would just every year tell us what to bring him. And just mysteriously, the money went away. So I truly want to understand it, as most of you do that are here tonight. And so one of our board members found Parker Herring. And then Parker graciously went out and found Cheryl Rhew for us. So these two ladies are going to explain this to us tonight. Make sure that you stay on to the end, and we promise to end exactly within an hour, because at the end I will put the evaluation up, and once you do the evaluation, immediately you will get the link to the certificate for training. So you won't have to wait for me to email it to you. Just hit print when you're done. When the evaluation certificate comes up, just hit print and you'll get it right then and there. If something happens and it's quirky or whatever, then just email me, and I'm the one that emailed you the Zoom link for tonight. So let's don't wait any further and let's hear from Parker.
Now we can't hear her.
All right, here we go. Does she know?
Parker, can you unmute yourself, please?
She was working earlier.
One of the hosts should be able to click on the participant button and unmute for her.
I got it. I've got it right here.
If you can't see your unmute option or mute option, try pressing escape.
The problem is I'm having to ask her to unmute. There we go.
Okay, so can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, my name is Parker Herring. I'm an adoption attorney. I practice in Raleigh. I started an adoption agency 20 years ago. I adopted, and my first adoption was extremely expensive, and so I started an agency in North Carolina. My agency's now had over 400 placements, and I've probably done between 900 and 950 adoptions. Unfortunately, adoption is expensive, but I think that the adoption tax credit is not very well understood. Now, I'm trying to move my screen down. And it's not moving down.
You've got to share your screen again.
Trying to advance the slide.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not letting me advance it. It's not letting me advance it. I'm using the up and down buttons.
Hang on a second, I'll pull it up on my end.
Okay, So this is just a synopsis of what kind of work I do. And I have 3 children, 2 are adopted, and then I had 1 that was born by advanced assisted reproduction techniques. So at this point, although I used to do divorce law, I do all adoption and some assisted reproduction. The adoption tax credit, I've always found, is challenging to explain. No matter how much I try, and I give handouts and talk to clients, and I always tell them to seek the help of a certified public accountant who has experience in doing adoption tax credits. So that's why I asked my friend Cheryl. Okay. I asked my friend Cheryl Rhew, who's a certified public accountant with the Raleigh CPA firm of Hughes, Pittman, and Gutman. She has over 20 years of experience in public accounting. So I send my adoption clients to her and say, when they start asking specific questions, and ask Cheryl to please talk to them. So I really suggest that you consider, given how much money's involved, is to associate a certified public accountant and always ask them exactly, how many of these they've done. She's a full tax partner and has done a lot of not-for-profit tax team work. I want to talk to you first about the history of the adoption tax credit, because I think it helps to understand how it's evolved. In an effort to reduce the cost of adoption, Congress adopted the federal adoption tax credit in 1996. Now, those of us who were practicing then remember it was only $5,000, which is a far cry from what it is now, because it's $14,300. And initially, families could deduct up to $5,000 in qualified adoption expenses. But still, in this law, families with low income and little or no tax liability could not take full advantage of the credit. So in 2001, Congress increased the adoption tax credit to $10,000 per adoption attempt, and the maximum was adjusted each year for inflation. It was scary to us adoption practitioners because we knew it would have to go by Congress each time. And we were nervous about that. But in 2001, it was increased. So in 2012, the good news is that the adoption tax credit once again became non-refundable, which meant that it can only be claimed by families with the tax liability. And generally still, this does exclude low-income families. And it also puts restriction on persons who are in the higher tax bracket. So it starts phasing out after $214,000. But parents who are adopting special needs children may be able to claim the full amount regardless of the expenses. But you have to note that the federal definition of special needs is unusually narrow. It excludes international adoptions and many children with disabilities. But the good news is most foster care adoptions qualify. And the further good news that in January, President Obama signed a bill to avert what we were seeing every year, because every year Congress was voting on it. And he made the adoption tax credit permanent, so we don't have to lobby every year for it. It's important to understand that many of you can get adoption assistance benefits from your employers, and you can exclude that from your taxable income. But this is where it's important to note that you can't claim both an exclusion and a tax credit for the same expenses. So let's look at, for example, if you spent $15,000 in qualified expenses, and we're going to review later what qualified expenses are, and one of the parents' employer provides adoption assistance. So you could claim the tax credit fully, which is $14,300, And then you could take out $700 from your taxable income. But this is what's really important. And I have adopted families sort of poo-poo the adoption tax credit, and they'll say, well, that's not helpful to me because it doesn't give me cash. No, the federal government is not handing you $14,300. It's important to note that it's a credit on your taxes, not cash. And it's also important to note that that credit can be spread out over 5 years. So you're getting the money back because you're not having to pay it in taxes. And because it can be spread over 5 years, that lets in a lot of income tax brackets so that you can use the adoption tax credit. So the tax credit for this year, 2020, gives each person, each family, a $14,300 credit if you meet the income guidelines. And then I explain what the income guidelines are. The full benefit of $14,300 goes to you if you together, you and your spouse or you and your partner, have a modified adjusted gross income of $214,250. So you're going to get $14,300 if your combined incomes are not over 214. And then there's a schedule where it phases out starting at $214,520 to $254,520 so that you can claim a partial credit. And people who have incomes above $254,520 can't claim any of the credit. But there are ways that you can finagle your income and make sure if you're right on the verge. So if you're near the initial phase, like I had a couple in my office today, and I talked to them about what their income was going to be. And they're close. They're like around 210. And I talked to them about how, you know, if you're near that initial phase out, then you can lower what your income is going to be by taking longer maternity leave to get the credit. So you really want to look at the fact that you don't want to lose. If you're near that 214, you are better off lowering your income. And don't tell the IRS I said that, but you're better off lowering your income by taking a longer maternity leave. Now note that if you have one of those generous employers who gives you adoption assistance, you are able to take advantage of both programs.
The class I signed up for is supposed to help you with this.
Just you can take advantage of both programs, just not with the same expenses.
No, it's just, it does go to her.
And let me just advance to the next slide. Okay. Adoption expenses. I'm going to let Cheryl talk about qualified adoption expenses so that you will understand what they are. Okay, Cheryl?
Okay. So now we're getting to the meat of how the credit actually works. And fortunately, the definition of qualified adoption expenses is purposefully vague. So the magic words are expenses that are reasonable and necessary, directly related to and for the principal purpose of the legal adoption of an eligible child. There's no further definition given by the IRS as to what reasonable and necessary means.
He's not adopted here, so we don't.
There is, this comes down to what we refer in the tax arena as a facts and circumstances situation to determine what is reasonable and what is necessary. As long as the taxpayer can support the reasonableness and necessity of the expenses, then more than likely they'll qualify. However, there are certain expenses that are expressly determined by the IRS to be not qualified. And those type expenses are any that are reimbursed by either an agency or by an employer. So if the taxpayer is reimbursed for expenses, they didn't really have a cash outlay, so they can't use those expenses for the credit. The adoption of a spouse's child are not qualified expenses, or expenses for adoption through any type of surrogacy. So there are items, there are expenses that are specifically stated as not qualifying, but the expenses that are determined to be qualifying is purposefully vague. So one thing that I've always thought was interesting with tax laws is that they aren't just in place as revenue generators for the government. They are also in place to try and encourage certain behaviors, and with the US taxpayers through deductions or credits. And the adoption credit's a prime example of something that is in the tax laws just to
Mute that.
help facilitate that behavior among the US taxpayers. Energy efficiency credit, people that improve their homes get a credit, the electric vehicle. So there's always a risk of audit in the sense of making sure that the credit is used appropriately, but it's there because the IRS and Congress and the government wants taxpayers to do this, to adopt. And let's see what else. And the special needs children, there's special rules for that. And again, is to facilitate that type of behavior. Okay, you can go.
Sorry about that.
So I'm not going to read all this, but like Parker said before, it is a good idea to consult with a tax advisor or do your own research and then verify what you think you know with the tax advisor, because there's two main factors. One is determining the eligibility of the expenses, and the other is determining the timing of when the expenses can be used to actually claim the credit. And if it's not handled properly, the timing of the credit or the type of expenses, it could result in missed credit opportunities if you don't do it in the right year, or additional costs and delays for having to file an amended returns if you don't seek a professional initially. Now, there's several factors that will depend on when the credit is claimed. And I don't think we have specific slides on this, but we'll talk about this more in general, probably during the question and answer session. But the factors are whether it's domestic or foreign child that's being adopted, whether it's a failed or successful adoption, and then just the timing of when the expenses are paid. All of those factors together determine when the credit can be claimed. And there's different combinations of those factors that come out with different results. So here's some important steps to consider when actually filing for the credit. Now, I'm not going to go through the form itself because that's what the tax professional will do, but a lot of these suggestions, and I'll let you read through those, but a lot of these suggestions are really the same suggestions and good advice for anything you might claim on your tax return, is to get organized. And I know when you're going through the process, a lot of times it's a long, drawn out process. And so it's easy for expenses to get misplaced or receipts to get misplaced. And it's hard to reconstruct things that are after the fact. So as you're going through the process, as you're incurring the expenses, don't bother trying to determine, does it qualify? Does it not qualify? Just gather everything and then you'll have it. And then when it comes time to either see your CPA or determine the credit, you'll have it. And there's some mechanisms there that Google Drive and Dropbox are some examples of where you can keep it electronically and in paper. So again, keep track of all your expenses in Excel. It's good to scan them and wait, you have a paper copy and electronic copy. And there's no longer requirement to attach anything to your tax return, But just like anything else you report on your tax return, you want to make sure you maintain those documentations for at least a 4-year period, if not longer. So going the first one there, that's important because you need to have a receipt, but you also need to have proof of the payment. So you may have a documentation from an agency or a documentation from a lawyer of what the bill was, but if you don't have a documentation that it was actually paid, then it wouldn't qualify. So you need both. Again, make copies. Again, you don't need to send them with the return, but you do need to have them in your possession if you ever have to show proof of anything. And it's a good point in there about a lot of receipts will fade over time. And so you may think you've stored it and then you have to pull it out. Because if an audit's going to occur, it'll occur within 2 to 3 years of filing your tax return. It won't, more than likely won't happen immediately. And so that's why it's a good reason to scan them, because it'll stay longer without any kind of ink fading or papers getting wrinkled or misplaced. So this is a good example, and I'll give you time to read through that, but this isn't really something that needs to be done prior to submitting your return, but it's really good advice for if you're under audit and if you have to actually present your documentation to the IRS to organize it like this, because it'll go a long ways to shortening the audit, and the agent will be less likely to dig into everything if it's very organized and if you have your I's dotted and your T's crossed. Go ahead. So the most important things to keep is the adoption decree that has the official seal. And of course, like we said, any of the expenses, and just make sure that whatever you're claiming isn't something that is a estimated number. It's an actual factual number, that you have a receipt, you have the documentation. Not, I've met with a lot of
Lost her. Cheryl was.
Did we lose Cheryl?
Yeah, she went on mute.
The
the whole time,
No, just there.
No.
because I didn't change anything.
No, but.
I accidentally
Starting-
muted you. I meant to mute somebody else. I apologize. That was my fault.
Okay.
You
Well,
can
that probably
start
said
with
my
that.
most great, the best words of wisdom the whole time. So was it on this slide that I stopped?
Number 8, you hadn't gotten into.
Okay. So what I was saying about this one is that if you receive an IRS notice, to stay calm, don't panic, because a lot of times the notices are just computer generated, they're randomly selected. And if you have your documentation, there's nothing to be concerned about anyways. You just either respond back through letter, or if you worked with a CPA, give the notice to your CPA, let them draft a letter for you. And it depends on what the notice is. Sometimes they'll request additional documentation. Sometimes they'll set up a time to come out and look at it. But whatever the notice is, if you have your documentation, you can address it. So the main thing is to stay calm and not to ignore it. I've worked with a lot of taxpayers who, for some reason, ignore it, but it does not go away if you ignore it. So it's best to handle it straight on.
Before we start talking about some common questions, I just wanted to add a few things to what Cheryl has said. I think it's helpful to include in your expenses a copy of your affidavit that you file with the court, because that is a very good summary of most of your expenses. There's a line for agency fees. There's a line for legal expenses. There's a line for court filing expenses. And then generally things like how much it costs you to get your fingerprints, how much it costs you to get your criminal records, whether you paid for a website domain host to run your, your website. So the affidavit, which is filed with the court, which you will be signing toward the end of your adoption, I think is also very good documentation.
It's a great point.
And I think that, because it is a sworn affidavit, it gives some credibility, and it was filed with the court, and you file that at the very end. And so it's helpful to include that because it really can validate what you spent. Now, I know that a lot of people don't include on their affidavits some expenses that you have with adoption, but they can add up. So even if you're adopting within the state of North Carolina and you travel from, say, Raleigh to Asheville, which I just had a couple do, you're going to have mileage there and back. You're going to have hotel fees. So you really should include any of those things. If you gave a gift to the birth mom, what's your birth mother expenses? If you help pay for birth mother expenses, those are spelled out on your affidavit, and those are legitimate adoption expenses. Some people often also pay in the adoption process to have a profile done or to have somebody do a website for them, and those are legitimate adoption expenses too, or at least try to make them, legitimate. But definitely the fingerprints costs, the criminal records check, they're small, but they add up. But if you spend a week in another city, and those costs are going to add up as well. Some of the most common questions that I get, and Cheryl can certainly cue in on this too, but people will say, what constitutes a failed adoption? Because people want to, for example, if you're registered with an agency and you put your profile up numerous times and you're not chosen, that, in my opinion, and I believe the IRS would agree with that, is not a failed adoption. But if you are matched with a birth mother and places and then revokes, or if at the very end she changes her mind, so those are basically failed adoptions. You were matched, you were expecting to adopt that baby. I had a couple this week, it was very sad. Birth mom signed documents and the next day changed her mind. So that's a formal revocation. If that couple has not been placed with another child this year, then they can use all of those expenses that they paid, whether it's for legal fees or agency expenses, the fact they did stay out of town, etc. They can use those. But it's a failed adoption, one in which you're actually matched, just not one where you're continuously putting yourself out there. So you can apply for the adoption tax credit just if your profile was shown and you're not chosen. So, but if you did have a failed adoption and you spent, say, $7,000, you can get some tax relief. The other question I get from a lot of people that say, should I try to file the credit on my own or consult with a CPA? And my recommendation is that you definitely at least consult with a CPA, because the IRS does audit a large percentage of these cases. So you want to make sure that you are working on very good advice, and I think the IRS would notice if you had a CPA preparing this. I also did want to mention to you that when saving your expenses, from the very beginning, come up with a record keeping way. I mean, the worst is just throwing it all in an envelope, but Excel spreadsheets and Google Drive are excellent. And not only, just remember what Cheryl said, it's not just having the receipts, but you need the cancel check or the credit card payment to show that you actually spent it. Those are the common questions that I see people ask, and we certainly would be happy to talk with you about any other questions and see if we can answer those. Also, Cheryl and I have put also on here our emails, so you can email us and say, you know, we heard you talk at the seminar and we have this question, and we will do our best to try to help you with that. Okay, so those are my prepared remarks, and I think what Cheryl has prepared, but we are certainly happy to answer any questions now.
So we have a couple in the chat. This is Joe. One of the questions is it correct that if we had no adoption expenses, we would not be eligible?
For the adoption credit in general?
Susan, maybe you could offer clarification with that question you had in chat.
Yeah, I was just asking, I'm sure some of us here, since this is a foster organization, are like, we've adopted through foster care, and that's really unclear with the adoption tax credit. I know personally, we just adopted a couple of weeks ago, and we did not have any expenses, or if we did, they were minimal and they were reimbursed by DSS. So we wouldn't have anything to enter. So are we even eligible for the adoption tax credit?
So maybe I might be the only one that finds this funny, but most tax questions, the answer is it depends. And this is a prime example of that answer. So if the child was determined by the state to be designated a special needs child, then yes,
Right.
you would still get the credit. If the child was not a special needs credit and you did not have any adoption expenses, then you would not be able to claim the credit.
Okay.
Is that tied to 4E eligibility?
I'm sorry, what?
Is that tied directly to 4E eligibility?
Parker and Gail, you may answer that one.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Yes, it is.
So I know if the state is determined that special needs, then the credit is allowed whether you have any expenses or not.
There is sometimes though that adoptions are not 4E eligible. They can be state funded and still be a special needs adoption. Would they still qualify?
Right, as long as the child's been determined to be a special needs child.
So I'm in the
And
same
like
boat.
Parker said, special needs doesn't necessarily mean disability. There's other definitions for this purpose. I wanted to actually read what those were.
Unilateral control of these governing bodies locally.
The state has determined the child cannot or should not be returned to his or her parent's home. The state has determined that the child will not be adopted unless assistance is provided to the adopting parent. The child's ethnic background and age, whether the child is a member of a minority or sibling group, and whether the child has a medical condition or physical, mental, or emotional handicap. So it's a state, you know, we as a CPA or we as the IRS don't determine the eligibility, the state determines the eligibility.
So the way it was explained to me by my CPA was that ineligible to return to their home, that, I mean, that in itself is the definition. I mean, that's why we go to adoption or, you know, that kind of thing most of the time. And so that right there would just about qualify majority of our cases.
Right.
And so in that sense, that would be special needs, and all you have to do is present that, and you're good. And like, so we had one kid that was deemed special needs because of, you know, a disability, but then we had another one that was called into that wording. And it wasn't, I mean, it was not, it wasn't even like a big discussion. It was a yes, no question, and that was it. Boom. And then we claimed both of them.
So can I ask a follow-up question to that related? And I don't want to take over. I'm sure other people have questions, but so in the sense of like saying that the biological parents were not deemed able to take care of, like you said, that's most of foster care. So that would then put ours in that category. What type of documentation would we, I know we don't turn anything in, but to cover ourselves for 4 years, what do we need to keep in a file stating that those rights were taken away?
I mean, you just have your adoption decree, and I mean, if they come
Okay.
back, then they would get it from the court if they needed
Okay.
it.
Gail?
And
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Hey, Gail, I'm the adoption social worker for Transylvania County Social Services.
There we go.
And in the state of North Carolina, for a child to be deemed special needs, the adoption social worker and the family must enter into an adoption assistance agreement.
Right.
It's a DSS 5012, which is adoption
Mhm.
eligibility form, and the DSS 5013 is the eligibility agreement. So those are the two forms that determine the special needs and determines if there's a monthly stipend and or Medicaid attached to it. So those two documents may be helpful for
Absolutely.
the
Thank you for clarifying that. But then the other thing is, the problem is the paperwork that's coming out of the federal isn't aligning to what we're doing here at the state per se. And I mean, this was exactly what our CPA said to us. And so it was a yes, no question. And I mean, we were never even questioned on anything.
Okay.
We had two that went through at the same time.
So from my better understanding, when I'm working with families that may not qualify for special needs adoption based on the criteria that we look at for adoption assistance eligibility, should we still be referring them to a CPA? Because it sounds like some of the other criteria at the federal level may be different than what the North Carolina code is saying.
Yes, and it's a wider
that's
spread. And Cheryl, will you send me that special needs blurb that you just read?
That list? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I can send it out to everyone.
And the documentation required is specifically lists that adoption assistance agreement that someone just spoke about.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm in this exact same boat. I've got 2 children adopted through foster care. They get adoption assistance. We're in an adoption assistance agreement. So it sounds like we would qualify.
Right.
We also have 0 expenses. And when, I'm going in my tax software and putting in 0 expenses, and it's literally not letting me type 0. I have to type at least $1. So I'm guessing I need to put in the full amount of the credit.
Yes.
Even though I don't actually have any, because it's like, what are your expenses? My expenses are 0, but in order to claim the credit, I have to actually enter that amount, the full amount of the credit.
Right. I can't speak to how your software works, but how the form works, you put that in, but then I believe there's another box or question that you mark that says it's a special needs adoption.
Right.
Which
Yeah,
allows
and it's
you
got
to
a
enter the
checkbox
credit.
for that, but it's like when I put in 0, it just doesn't do it. It doesn't generate anything. It won't let me.
And I'll add to that as well. This is Joe Allen. I file with TurboTax every year, and in my experience thus far, they've been pretty good about asking the questions that are necessary to be able to claim the tax credit. And in TurboTax, it didn't require me to put a dollar amount, and it did require me, if I put 0, to put in a carry forward from one of the documents from the previously filed year. And maybe Cheryl can add more about what that means, but I'm not sure.
I really can't address anything about TurboTax. I don't know that software, but and I don't know what carry forward it was asking you for. But you bring up a good point that we didn't really stress in the beginning too much is the 14,300, and someone mentioned they have 2 in 1 year, so that's double. It's 28,600, so that's a huge credit in 1 year. So if your tax liability isn't that much, if your tax liability is only 10,000, then the extra 18,000 gets carried forward and you get to use it for 5 more years or however long. Well, the shorter or 5 years at the most. So if you can use most of the remaining of it in the next year, then you get to use it all in the next year. If not, you get to keep using it for the next 5 years. So I didn't want to leave you misled thinking that it was a 5-year spread, that it had to be spread over 5 years.
I have a question. We adopted 2 boys this year. They both are one's both are African American, one's biracial. We didn't qualify for any adoption assistance because we adopted them before they were 2. They were both relinquishments from the hospital. We were told that we would qualify for adoption credit.
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Okay, so my question is, even though we didn't pay anything out of our pockets, because we adopted from DSS, we're foster parents, and we had 2 relinquished babies. We got them 2 separate years, but their adoptions, one was April of this year and one was December 14th of this year. Are we eligible even though we didn't pay anything for the adoption credit tax?
As long as they're designated special needs adoptions, then yes.
How do you find out that if it's special needs? That was never mentioned. We've never even heard that word.
Are you
From
in
your
North,
social worker, you didn't get that information?
I'm sorry?
are you
your
in North
social-
Carolina?
Yes, we live in Salisbury. We're
Your children are
DSS.
minorities, so they automatically qualify.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
So another question about the carry forward. I've actually got one child that was adopted a couple years ago, so I'm looking at filing an amended return. How does my carry forward work with an amended return?
The same. So if you file a 20, I don't know which year you're going to amend, but if you file a 2019, if you're going to file a 2019 tax return, whatever credit is not used, if any, on that 19 tax return will roll forward into your 2020 tax return.
Okay.
The issue that could come up, however, you may want to extend your 2020 tax return, because if you file a 2019 tax return, it could take 6 to 9 months for them to process that 19 tax return. So if you claim on your 2020 tax return a credit from 19, the IRS isn't going to show that you have a credit from 19.
Right. So it's 5 years from, like, say if it was an amended 2017, it'd be 5 years from 2017, not from when the amended return was filed.
It's per tax year. That's right. So if you amend your 2017 tax return now, you still use it in the subsequent years from 2017.
Right. Okay.
So some of the questions that we're seeing in the chat as well are also related to taxes, as related to being in foster care as well. So maybe y'all can listen to maybe y'all could help with this as well. One of the question was, are there any types of tax credit for fostering at all? If there are, what are they? And second, outside of claiming them as a dependent, if they have been placed in their home for more than 6 months?
There's no credit just for the fostering. It's the adoption.
Okay.
But you can claim them as a dependent as long as they've been in your house more than
For more than
half the
50%
year.
of the year.
Yeah.
Right. And then there was a question about if the biological family claims them, how do you right that wrong? And that's you taking your placement letter that you get from the county level and submitting it to the IRS and the state, and they will fix it. We had that happen
for me last year.
Well, they should have, but you always want to file early because you know those family members are going to file early. And so the earlier you file, the less trouble it is. Because if you file before the biological family files, then they have to try to prove that they're not with you instead of you having to prove that they're with you.
My question was that I had the kids from September 25th of 2019 through April of 2020, so it's split 2 years. Does that not count because it's
No.
not full 6 months in each year?
Yeah.
Right. The eligibility is per tax year.
What happens if you have a child that lived with you for, okay, so it was 2 days short of the 6 months and 1 day, but she has been in 15 other placements since she's left here. So she has had no stability. So we, carried her. I mean, we took care of her more than anybody else throughout the year. Would we be eligible to claim her?
That's one I'd have to get back with you on. That's not something I see every day.
Okay,
I
because
would
I've
try
done
it.
I've done that before with my CPI. I just told them how long they lived with us and how long they lived here and there and everywhere else, and we were eligible to claim them. I know this placement has had, I think, 15 other homes since she left my home last July, and she's still not in a stable placement. But she was with us until June 29th.
You should be able to claim them because if anybody else tried to claim them, you can prove that they were with you longer than that other person.
But if you can email that in, Cheryl and I can talk about it. But I tend to think you can be, but let us talk about it, emailing that question to both of us, okay? And set forth the facts. I wanted to comment, someone talked about adoption assistance, and Gail, you said, well, if they're minorities, they would apply. My experience has been with adoption assistance that doing a cover letter and attaching documentation of the other issues is pretty key. For example, I'm working with a family that just adopted triplets. So it's a sibling group, so I know that's going to help them. But there's also drug exposure, and they were premature. So I've advised them to go ahead and put this in a cover letter and then attach copies from the medical records to show that they were 29 weeks, to show that the birth mother was tested positive for opioids, show that the baby's tested positive for opioids, and doing that, because what I've observed is that when the worker is looking at the adoption assistance, the easier you can make it by a cover letter and attaching documents, the better your chances are going to be of getting the adoption assistance.
Okay, so we adopted a little boy, and he was born dependent on opioids, and he was in the hospital. I don't know, 2, 3, 4 weeks, and because we adopted him under the age of 2, they said we did not qualify for any adoption assistance whatsoever, even though he was born dependent.
That's not true. I mean, he's automatically qualifies because he's a minority, even if he wasn't drug addicted.
But adoption assistance is what, okay, I'm thinking of an adoption stipend, I guess. I'm not, okay, so I'm kind of confused. Adoption assistance that we talk about is a monthly check that you get. But I know we can qualify him for the tax credit. But for the adoption assistance per month, they said we would not qualify even though he was born dependent on drugs. Nothing.
Yeah, they changed the law 2 years ago and put in that 2-year requirement, which, I don't agree with, but they did do that.
Honestly, it's dependent on the county. What they're willing to do changes from county to county, because if he was drug addicted, then they should be giving you adoption assistance, because you should have had a doctor, a pediatrician, somebody write something stating that the drug dependency that he was born with is going to affect him later on in life.
That's
And
right.
And
you
having
can
that
also-
documentation, which would have qualified him.
So
Yeah,
this is
okay.
because of Buncombe DSS, and I do adoption assistance for Buncombe. So that's only partially true. That being drug dependent at birth puts you in a potential category unless there is an active diagnosis that's affecting functioning or impacting functioning. They will not qualify for adoption assistance just because you're born drug addicted.
But you want to apply anyway and get potential, so if problems develop down the road, then it will certainly make it a lot easier.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because
The
later on,
assistance-
if a diagnosis happens that can be related back to that identified risk factor of being drug exposed, then you can look at amending the agreement to initiate benefits.
Assistance
So
is
how-
different than the credit, and I saw, they were getting close on time, but I saw a chat question pop up that I think we should address, and I think the question was if someone incurred expenses in 2020.
Yep.
But the
I was-
adoption.
I was just about to say the same.
So I think that's an important question. So if someone has adoption expenses in 2020, but the adoption was not finalized in 2020, then those expenses can be used for the credit in 2021. You have to wait a year and do it and claim the credit in the following year. And if it's, we didn't talk about international, I know that this is the Foster Family Alliance, but just for general knowledge, if it's an international adoption, then you can't claim the expenses at all until the adoption is actually finalized. And if it's not finalized, then you never get the adoption. So again, going back to tax policy, they're trying to encourage the US taxpayers to adopt domestically because that's more advantageous than international, but there is some credit if you do international as well. And of course, there's even more credit for the foster families because most of those children will be special needs children.
So if the adoption starts in 2020, but it's not completed till 2021, do we wait till 2000 for the 21 taxes to file for the credit, or can you file it for 2020?
It's in the year the adoption is finalized.
Okay.
All right, so it's 7:59 and I promised that we would stick to an hour. So let me post the evaluation and the link to the certificate on here, so you can just click that and go to it, so it's there. Cheryl, do you mind, I've had several people ask for your email. Do you mind putting it in, you and Parker both putting your email in the chat box down here?
Yeah, it's at the end of the PowerPoint.
She'd have to reshare her screen.
Yeah, okay. How do I put it in chat?
And someone asked a question, it's the adoption credit per adoption, and that answers yes.
Yeah.
Or per child, I should say.
Yeah. So if you adopt two, you got $29,000 to chew through in 5 years.
We also had another question. Can you send out the PowerPoint?
I can do that with your
Okay.
permission. Yep.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay.
And I want everyone to please thank Cheryl because I did sort of suck her into this. So I appreciate her helping.
Yeah, I knew there'd be a lot of questions at the end, so we tried
Thank
to save
you.
as much time as we could.
Yes, thank you very much, both.
Thank you.
And thank you all for adopting.
Well, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
thank you for your wonderful talk.
Very much so.
Just fabulous.
Good.
Okay.
Thank y'all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Good night.